Good morning. Welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. I've been on a mini hiatus, primarily because of this. I don't know, Skyrim's just, I don't know, been the vibe. It's one of those games I come back to at least once a year or two to, just replay through. I just let it absorb me into the world and spit me back out about a month later feeling refreshed and ready to do something else. It was once again Skyrim month, and I have a lot I want to talk about. Honestly, I have so much that I have a script backlog stemming back at least a few years, but I don't know how to get the ball rolling. And so I thought I would start at the beginning. I want to ask what it is and why it is that I just keep coming back to this game over and over and over again. The answer to this question is not so simple. It's a mixture of a little bit of everything, really. It's not just the ambience or the lore or the world or the gameplay. It's a little bit of everything, and how Skyrim manages to achieve a balance between so many points and fixtures in time, a kind of nexus of ideas and directions that result in a world that is both approachable and engrossing. And I want to talk about all of it, everything from its successes to its failures, to why I think this game has persisted despite its flaws and the myriad of more technically competent games that have spawned from its inception. So let's sit down and ask how Skyrim is doing 13 years later. I'd love to say that this video will be interesting to watch. It won't. This is going to be more of a podcast kind of thing. But if you want to join me in just sort of feeling the vibes and the ambience, we're going to be riding from Winterhold to Falkreath here in the background. Otherwise, it'll just be talk, so boot up your own copy or whatever, and let's break this down into chapters. Firstly, this is a part 1. I want to talk about the impact of Skyrim and how the game works in this particular video, but in part 2, we're going to be looking at the world building and the story that the game has to offer. It's a little bit cleaner for me to talk about one and then the other, since they're related, but not intertwined. So, let's truly start at the beginning. Skyrim exists as this kind of middle point between old Bethesda and modern Bethesda. It's a kind of crossroads, a song of what was and what will be. And I think that's why this game has remained so integral to the modern conversation surrounding fantasy RPGs. Before Skyrim, we had Morrowind and Oblivion, the two games that make up this kind of modern canon of the Elder Scrolls. Running kind of contemporarily with the releases of these two games were Fallout 3 and New Vegas, though Vegas was actually produced by Obsidian. That difference does matter, but we'll cross that bridge later. This kind of pre-Skyrim era is often looked favorably upon, especially by old hands of the genre, who see the freedom of choice in gameplay and the kind of out-there, truly fantasy storytelling as encapsulating what fantasy really should be, at least to that kind of player. However, what I think is also worth noting here is the clear roots this era has in tabletop gaming. Elder Scrolls clearly was based on old systems like D&D, while Fallout is based out of a system called GURPS. The tropes and imagery are based in things that wouldn't be out of place in the next Critical Role session. Games after Skyrim kind of mark this move towards a combination of greater graphical fidelity, a less rigid adherence to tabletop applicable systems, and leaning more into the capacities a computer actually gives while maintaining those old point system trappings, and leans heavily into more of the first-person shooter aspect of the genre rather than relying on old RPG tropes. This kind of makes a mark between the old, quote-unquote, good Bethesda and the modern Bethesda, who many seem to believe couldn't find a good idea if it was taped to their face. To a certain point, I find this conversation disingenuous. It ignores the demands and needs of modern tech and industry while simultaneously glorifying a past that, if anything, was even less accessible and understandable. I beg any one of you who thinks that Morrowind is a good game but hasn't actually played it to go back and boot up a copy. I did, and honestly what I found was exactly what I expected to find. No map markers, obtruse and flowerily written instructions, a complete lack of instruction about core gameplay systems, and zero direction beyond they went that way. I have played this game before, only it was called Vanilla World of Warcraft. Meanwhile, when I boot into Fallout 4, I know exactly where I'm going, what I'm doing, how to use the systems to the best of their ability, and I have a reason to do things beyond fuck around and find out. The downside is that Morrowind has a story to tell that even now we're still unraveling the mysteries of. Whereas Fallout 4, it just doesn't. There's no subtext in Fallout 4, no great world to discover, no mysteries to find. It was all spelled out for you in the first 10 minutes of the game, and you're not even left wondering what the world was like before the bombs fell, a hallmark of previous games. Skyrim kind of bridges these two landscapes in a way that almost seems to capture a shifting of the guard. Old hands retiring and new hands taking on the reins of these old franchises and concepts to steer them in new directions. When I look at this game, I see some of the old depth of Morrowind and Oblivion, but I also see the smoothed out, simplified, and, well, frankly, accessible mechanical underbelly of the modern gaming world. Accessibility in all things is necessary. It may be a badge of honor to those who went without, but it is also not a badge we should force our children to earn as well. And at the same time, accessibility and aesthetic beauty shouldn't necessarily eat away at the resources needed to tell a good, meaningful story. Skyrim sits at the nexus point, a lesson not quite learned, but which benefits from the marriage of these two philosophies. When I look at old ruins in a game like Avowed or Veilguard, I'm not asking myself if I'll ever get to understand these people. Oh, I will meet them, sure as Chekhov's gun will fire by the third act, but I'm almost guaranteed to not relate or understand, because in meeting them nothing of meaning will be gained. It will be a show, not an experience. And on the other hand, I will never know who built the Nordic ruins of Skyrim, but every moment I walk through their barrows, I experience a glimmer of who and what they might have been. I don't need to meet one of the Dwemer to understand who they were as a people. The game lets me find these things out for myself, and in doing so gives me the freedom to draw my own conclusions. Fallout 4 and many modern RPG games just don't give me this benefit of the doubt. But on the other hand, older games give me far too much, and presume that I will just inherently understand the landscape I've been dropped into. There's a kind of unfairness in these approaches that Skyrim, for all its many, many faults, simply manages to dodge by the good grace of its timing. With this prelude out of the way, I think the next place we need to go is into talking about Skyrim's systems, also known as why everybody plays Stealth Archer. This is not a mystery to me, and I'd be surprised if it's a mystery to you as well. The real point of interest is how all of us came to this same conclusion, because I certainly didn't get here the same way that you did. When Skyrim released back in November of 2011, my roommate picked up a copy for the house on just about the day of the drop. However, I was going to be like the third in line to play, so instead of pretending like I had any hope of getting my hands on the thing, I decided to go back and play its prequel, Oblivion, until someone finally got bored. Up until that point, I'd been playing World of Warcraft, and so I decided pretty early on that I was just going to play a good old hack-and-slash style of character out of sheer familiarity. This kind of worked for the early levels right up until I got to my first Oblivion gate. At that point, I proceeded to die over and over and over again. It was at this point I decided to re-evaluate. If running headlong into an enemy wasn't working, and magic used up too many resources, then obviously that really only left the bow. Now, I was never one for the coward's approach, but at a certain point I just had to respect that if an enemy saw me, I was going to get trounced. So on my second run, I built an honest-to-goodness Oblivion Stealth Archer. The game immediately became far more fun and manageable, and I got quite far into my ruin delving before someone finally decided to hand me the controller. Having learned my lesson, I decided to go Stealth Archer again, figuring that Skyrim probably wasn't going to be that much more different compared to Oblivion. And imagine my surprise when, years later, I found out that the rest of the player base had come to the same conclusion as me. But it goes even deeper than this, though. Even though Skyrim's combat system, it truly is different to its predecessors, the more I played through the tutorial, the more I realized that Skyrim was reinforcing in me the same message I had learned through Heartache so many years ago. The first fight you have in Helgen is an all-out sword and board brawl, where you get to experience the pain of having no healing items, and potentially not realizing that there's a healing spell already in your character menu. And then you get attacked by wizards, make the connection that distance gives you more time to live, and then finally, when you get your hands on a bow and are taught how to sneak, well, it doesn't take a genius to put together that can't be seen and reach out and touch someone from far away is an immediate game winner combo. From there, it only ever keeps up. You can choose to fight the spider attacking Arvel head-on, getting yourself poisoned in the process. You could burn it with fire, running out of mana before you're halfway down its health bar. Or you could just shoot it from behind a pillar where it literally cannot reach you. There are other soft factors at play here, though. Skyrim is an RPG game, and part of the role-playing game is learning about and engaging with the world. Stealth Archer lets you do that in a way that no other system can compete with. If you're willing to sit down, shut up, and listen, the game will reward your patience with storytelling. Bandits aren't just fodder. They have stories and songs. They know they're in a dangerous and precarious position, and they all feel some kind of way about that. You just have to be willing to let them talk. And that's not something you can or even should do if you're playing the guy on the box art. However, the flip side of this is the tools the game gives you to play another style, or rather the lack thereof. If you want to play a mage, you better be willing to slog it as a squishy target for a long while before you can find enough gold and start buying spells. You get 3 when you start the game, and after that, not even the Mage's College can really help you. You have to explore, and what are you going to do if your tiny mana pool and lack of armor keeps you in a cycle of death for half the game? You're going to go to something easier. The game doesn't punish you for switching gameplay styles midway through, so it should be easy to just come back to that mage idea when you're a little better prepared, right? But in the meantime, if you're broke, if you don't have the magic or the money for spell trap, if you don't have the resources for crafting your own gear and potions and enchanting, what are you going to do? You're going to stay out of combat and pick your targets. In other words, all early roads lead to Stealth Archer. This is a problem with Skyrim precisely because of the guy on the box art, though. However, in any game where shooting is the main focus of the advertisement, this isn't a gameplay weakness, but rather a game running smoothly. Pick up any game where you have the choice to brawl, set traps, attempt to be clever, or just pick up a gun, and 9 times out of 10, the player is going to choose the gun. It's fine in Fallout and Far Cry, where modern weaponry should be superior to a knife fight. But in a fantasy game like Skyrim, this feels fantasy breaking and antithetical. I've seen plenty of games try and remedy this, either by making their bows a non-viable option, or having clunky controls, or just not giving you ranged options, and all it does is give you the problems of melee and magic without providing useful answers. When you get your butt handed to you in Dark Souls, you don't think to yourself, I should go get a bow. When you fail a stealth attack in Dishonored, the answer isn't upgrade the crossbow. The answer is get good scrub, and either you do, or you put down the game. So if Skyrim is not unique in its Stealth Archer plague, then maybe the next question we need to ask ourselves is, why? If you want to play a video game, you have to use some kind of hardware intermediary. There's no jacking a cable into your spine and hallucinating the ride of a lifetime. You have to use some kind of tool. And in the modern day, you have 3 options. You can play on computer, on console, or with VR. Skyrim handily exists on all 3, so it's easy to compare and contrast the flaws of each system with a nice control base. Unfortunately, this is a Bethesda title, which means there can only be one winner by default. It's console controls. Sorry, console controls just wins here. It just does. I'm sorry. When it comes to playing a Bethesda title, you need to get yourself a proper Xbox-style controller, or you are in for a world of either frustration or nausea. The computer controls for Skyrim just don't do the trick. Yeah, you can adapt. Yeah, the controls are simple enough-ish. But not only does Skyrim fail to fully utilize the strengths of keyboard and mouse, but it actively hamstrings your gameplay. The combat of Skyrim is just fast enough that keyboard is a little slow and clunky, and just slow enough that your mouse speed will actively fight against you. Controller doesn't have that problem. And meanwhile, VR is... well, it's VR. If you're prone to motion sickness, this is the wrong system for you. The problem with this controller-focused optimization, whether it be in the actual design of the game or a necessity of porting, is that it inherently limits how complicated the controls and systems are allowed to be. On a given game, on keyboard, if you want to key your spells to all the numbers on your hotbar for quick access, you can do that. On console, though, if you want to swap spells, you probably need to use a menu. This interrupts the flow of combat, and it isn't just a Skyrim problem, it's an industry problem, and nobody has yet figured out a clean way to fix this. This attempt to balance three kinds of gameplay that require three wildly different kinds of controlscapes creates a kind of Sisyphean problem. Either you build your gameplay around magic so that the keys all relate to specific spells and you can combo and still have room to move around, or you lean into melee and really focus on things like timing and camera angles, or you go for shooter, which asks you to do the impossible setup of, and get this, pointing and clicking. Shooter is a mass market appeal genre for a reason. The fighter games like Smash Bros. Have mass market appeal, and they've got a good recipe for, good, invigorating, and engaging gameplay that they've had for well over a decade. But learning combos and stringing them together is a lot less accessible than look at a place and click a button to remove the problem. It's no wonder Skyrim suffers from this, but there are answers if you're willing to look at the tools the game wants to give you. In order to support its combat, Skyrim gives you a wealth of tools to beef up yourself, your gear, and to give you an edge in combat. These are the smithing, enchanting, and potion systems, respectively, and each one of these in turn has their own supporting systems looped back into standard gameplay. Smithing requires you to go out into the world and find ore nodes to mine, wildlife to hunt, or else buy from shops. The results are weapons and armor that, if you can push the system faster than you are leveling, will eventually give you decent and potentially overpowered gear with just a bit of grinding. However, you don't want to just throw away all the things that you've created with your smithing skill. You can sell them through bartering to increase your speech skill, or you can use these as enchanting blanks. Enchanting asks you to either buy or loot something called a soul gem, which comes in a variety of sizes, each increasing in the power they will confer the given item. And there's even an entire dimension that you can visit in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC that will elaborate on this system even further. This ends up benefiting your combat style by giving you semi-permanent buffs to your weapons and fully permanent buffs to your armor, but at the cost of not being able to improve them further until you're a master of your craft. Once again, this feeds into both combat and non-combat, and on the non-combat side, you will spend a decent amount of your time exploring and hunting for new enchantments to break down in order to give yourself new weapons and armor enchantments to use in combat. And likewise, in order to get those soul gems filled, you'll need to soul trap the creatures you fight, which is going to buff your conjuration skill in the meantime. And this creates its own kind of synergy with one of the core magic trees. Lastly, there is potion brewing, which asks you to go out into the world and pick flowers. Yeah, this sounds kind of out of left field for the game we've been describing, but this will feed into another chapter later down the line. Of course, you'll also need to fight your fair share of monsters as well, as many of the potion items can only be looted from the corpses of your enemies. The potions offer a one-time temporary buff or debuff. A skilled potioner doesn't need to fear running out of health and magicka and stamina potions, and a skilled poisoner will know the weaknesses of their enemies and exploit them with powerful drafts. Potions can even be used in tandem with the other two systems to give you benefits to both your smelting and enchanting, improving the quality of both. All three of these systems exist outside of combat, but directly feed into it. And I really like it. Not for the skills and buffs it gives you, but for the way it plays into the fantasy of this world. Let's be honest, most games don't encourage your character to have things like hobbies. If you're playing a collectathon like Spyro, then collecting things isn't a hobby, it's a secondary objective. And with playing something like a farming sim or a survival game, planting crops and progressing in all of these skill trees isn't, a fun afternoon, it's your meaningful progression. However, you don't ever have to enchant a single item in Skyrim in order to have enchanted gear. You don't have to brew potions or smelt equipment. The game will just give them to you. These skills are there if you want them, but they're by no means on the objective list. Oftentimes, the stuff you find around the world is actually better than what you're going to be making for a very long time. There's just no reason whatsoever to get into these systems unless you decide that you want to. And then, the game is happy to oblige. Regardless of how you slice it, though, in order to use these systems, you need to do things that don't just pertain to combat. If you want to be a good smith, you gotta go find your own wars, and that means exploring and finding the right caves and having the materials you need, and potions just needs you to go wander around the wilderness for a bit. And even enchanting, as combat-driven as it is, has a way for you to passively harvest souls if you're willing to take the journey to the soul cairn. Finding new enchantments isn't just down to what you're looting off your enemies, but what you can barter from shops and find exploring. In other words, these core systems that directly benefit combat can also incentivize you to, not be in combat. This, more than anything else, is, I think, why I keep coming back to Skyrim. Everything from the game's most popular build to its own core systems pushes you out of that never-ending grind for power and forces you to just sit down and live in the world. It offers you comfy chairs by the fire, good books to read, beautiful sunsets overlooking overworldly vistas, and things to do when you aren't fending for your life. You can fish, you can hunt, you can build a house. I mean, hell, if you're so inclined, you can do all of these things, essentially make a living by just menial labor. You don't even need to be a hero. The game politely asks you to be one, gives you ample opportunity to do so, but it also gives you just enough pauses and breaks to decide, I'm good. I think I'm gonna ride my horse from one side of the map to the other and count how many dragons I spot. And speaking of, you don't even need to fight the dragons if you don't want to. You can either choose not to progress the questline that far, or, to be honest, they're really only likely to engage somebody that can actually aggro it, and that basically means only the city guard. So, when you get that random proc when you ride into a new town and, there's a dragon there, yeah, you're gonna be shunted into fighting a dragon, but otherwise, if you don't grab a dragon's attention, it will just fly off into the middle distance after a little while. And this kind of slow, almost boring gameplay is something I really don't see outside of something like a farming simulator. You don't just decide one morning in Fallout that actually you don't want to fight bandits anymore, they will come for you, and you don't have a choice. Even outside of Bethesda titles, this really just isn't an option. I think it's because in some way the game is afraid of letting you have downtime. If you're not actively engaged, well then you might put the controller down, and if you do that, well who's to say you'll ever pick it back up? Skyrim doesn't fear this. It presumes that one way or another, you will be back. And if you're not, well, who cares? Bethesda already has your money. What do they care if you buy the game and never install it? This kind of callous disregard for active gameplay, evident in everything from the core combat to the interstitial systems, to the way you move about the world and how you explore the story, gives the game a strength that few others enjoy: active downtime. When you watch a YouTube video and you're not actually trying to learn anything from it, just filling the noise when you play your 1000th round of solitaire, you're engaging in active downtime. You are doing things, but you're not doing them with any kind of goal besides refreshment. It's a way to recover your social and emotional battery so that you can get back out there and be the active person the world expects you to be. It's a necessary part of the day, and how we choose to use our active downtime really depends on person to person. It could be hobbies, or laying on the couch staring into the void, or playing a game. Anything, really. And Skyrim does something neat with this concept, and I don't even know if Bethesda knew that this is what they were making. It offers you a way to experience those recollective pauses without having to leave the game completely. After doing a mega dungeon like Labyrinthian, you probably need a mental break, but you may not want to leave off for the night because maybe you have an in-game chore list and, well, frankly, maybe you have more time on your hands before bedtime or whatever. This is the time when you might choose to hop on your horse and ride back to Whiterun instead of fast traveling. Or you might find a table in the Bannered Mare and have a drink while listening to the bard song. Maybe you just boot up the game and let the ambience wash over you while you do a real-life task, like homework. I can't honestly think of another game that lets you do this safely and quietly. Maybe Animal Crossing. Maybe. And that's kind of the end of the list. When we write stories, we think about pacing. We need active scenes where the characters are challenged, and we need reflexive scenes where the characters are able to process what they went through. And while a book is at its most fun when it's speeding by with excitement and drama, you also need those pauses to let your audience breathe so you don't wear them out. And more, I see these pacing pauses neglected, from action movies to games to just living in real life. Skyrim, however, it doesn't just give you these pauses, it rewards you for them. If you're willing to sit quietly and listen, the story, the world, and the soul of the game will come and find you. We have been going back and forth for over a decade about whether Skyrim is immersive, and I think this is a question that only the individual and not the collective can answer. To some, Skyrim's constant menus and bugs and overall jank is simply due too much to interrupt the flow state that comes with true immersion. For others, however, like me, Skyrim is deeply immersive in a way that other games really can't approach. But also, I get immersed in puzzle games and videos about whether or not GTA 5's electric poles actually go anywhere, so I have to accept that I'm kind of on the far end of a bell curve. I think that while this question is important, it's a little bit misguided. What counts as immersive for me is not going to be immersive for you, and vice versa. I can lose myself completely in World of Warcraft for years at a time, and that game is not pretending to be anything more than a glorified carnival. But I can't enjoy Breath of the Wild, no matter how much I try. I find myself fighting with the Switch and befuddled by the combat. And no doubt, some of you are undoubtedly screaming heresy at me for this trespass upon what is clearly a perfect game. Regardless, I think immersion comes down more to your own capacity for suspension of disbelief than it does for what the game itself is doing. I am, as you've clearly figured out by now, very forgiving on Skyrim's faults. But it's also because, my dad was a programmer, I grew up in that world, and I know the limitations of what a computer program is capable of. It's easy to forget in this time of the magic, all-powerful algorithms and all-knowing AI that computers are just bits of rock we're shoving electricity into. But that doesn't mean we should. Likewise, for all of Skyrim's flaws, I find myself looking past the graphical bugs and the nonsensical glitches, and instead of just seeing the hallmarks of a bad company, enjoying them for making the game fun and unpredictable. And maybe it is a glass half full perspective, but what I can't deny is that Bethesda should have done more to avoid its current situation. A game should not be famous for its bugs, and yet when we think of Skyrim, that's probably the first or second thing that comes to mind. I said before that Skyrim is a kind of crossroads between what was and what is. There's no denying that modern Bethesda games release in a state that can only be described as comical. If there's quality control, they're clearly not given enough time or attention to actually do the job they were hired for. However, I don't think this trend started with Skyrim. Morrowind, if it had been handed to anyone with an eye for game-breaking systems and bugs, would never have let that game be released in the state it was. It was common for people to exploit the jump mechanic to literally fling themselves across a map on a whim, and that's just the most famous example. At bare minimum, there should have been guardrails against that kind of overwhelming exploitation. And yet, obviously, that kind of exploitable system persists into Skyrim and even modern-day games. If you want to exploit the alchemy bug to create weapons by level 5 that overflow the damage system, that's within your power right now. It's up to your discipline to decide not to do it. Is that kind of freedom immersive? Or is it the sign of a lazy company? That's something only you can decide for yourself. For me personally, I think it's both. I used to work in quality control, not in games, but in the aircraft field. I know the ins and outs of how that system works and why it's one of the first teams on the cutting room floor when it's time to artificially inflate corporate profits. Quality control has the one job, and it's to tell you how badly you fucked up. That's not news you want to hear after pouring weeks of your life into a project. And QC is important to the integrity of a project, yes, but the kind of emotional devastation they can reap on a team is not something to be ignored. Game developers and middle managers are only human. It doesn't take a lot for this kind of situation to become an us versus them kind of thing. And then there's the problem of economics. Having a good quality control team requires you to hire multiple people who are specialized in several subjects, who can accurately diagnose problems and hopefully provide solutions. And those are not easy people to find in any industry. They're expensive, and they're limited in what they can do in a short period of time. This kind of cost is justified when your bugs have real-world consequences, like planes falling out of the sky, Boeing, but when you're dealing with something like a video game, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry, it doesn't. And Skyrim is, once again, a focal point around which the industry inadvertently revolves. Although this time, I can't help but wonder if the effects are far more direct. Skyrim was released just before the dawn of the digital download renaissance, when CD copies still performed just as well as Steam purchases. And this put the developers in a weird space in terms of updates. While Bethesda did push out bug patches and update the engine, even releasing a refurbished version of the game in the form of the special edition, it still did little to stem the ocean flow of bugs. In response, the community got together and created the USSEP, or the unofficial Skyrim Special Edition patch. This gave the community a way to fix the problems that Bethesda either couldn't or wouldn't, and in the process became the touchstone around which the entire modding community would eventually rally. I can't help but wonder, however, whether this did more harm than good in the long run. While yeah, we can play a slightly more bug-free game with content functioning the way it was intended to, the ripple effects outside of our little community were perhaps predictable, but certainly not welcome. See, the thing is, if you have this really expensive quality control team who can barge through your door at all hours of the workday to tell you how you fucked up, and then you have to pay them a load of money to do that, wouldn't it be nice if instead you could just have people pay you to tell you you fucked up, and then for them to do so in places that you can ignore? Wouldn't it be nice if we had a ready-made player base who was enthusiastic about the success of a game, willing to do half the legwork themselves, and then, on top of all of that, would advertise your game through word of mouth? Wouldn't that just be wonderful? Right? To say that the modern method of crowdsourced quality control was unpredictable is, I think, a bit nearsighted and traditional. But what I can and happily will shout to the heavens is that it is a serious problem for both consumer protections and the economy. In the short term, yeah, it's nice to make head over heels on a project and get free, willing labor, but the number of cut jobs that this transition has created has been alarming, to say the least. You cannot have a functional economy if you just take and take and take and then never give back. If an employee doesn't make enough to spend on video games, your company is not going to sell video games. And they certainly won't be able to do that if they don't have the money, and if you don't hire employees and pay them a fair wage with reasonable security. I don't have hard proof that Skyrim created the system we see today, but I also don't think it's unreasonable to suspect it was at least one of the touchstones along the path. Whether we like it or not, this is a part of the legacy I think we need to acknowledge. As much as I feel we need to acknowledge how the actions of major game developers end up spreading to the rest of the industry, I also think we need to acknowledge how the community response reshapes its direction as well. Modding is one of those topics that varies heavily from community to community, with some IPs looking down on modding as unstable, unreliable, or even exploitative, and others seeing it as the pinnacle of their collective achievement. Skyrim is definitely in that latter category. Many players can't imagine a world where they would go back to an unmodded Skyrim. For my part, mods have really only become accessible to me through a kind of drip feeder, and only in the last 4 or 5 years or so. It wasn't until this year that I owned a copy of Computer Skyrim, and so I was dependent entirely on whether or not Bethesda would incorporate a mod workshop into the console version of the game. Something that, to their credit, they did eventually do. However, that too was in a precarious state. Not all mods can or will be ported to console version. And that means if you want to rebuild console Skyrim, you're working with a sporadic and shortened list. You can download a handful of the really big mods like Inigo or Moonpath to Elsewhere, but a lot of the time it kind of feels like you're getting the cast-off dregs or only half a project. Even then, there's no guarantee that it'll actually function, or that the game will correctly create a load order. It was something I did cautiously, and with, if I'm honest, a bit of jealousy for the people who could get the full modded Skyrim experience. And that was a major driver in my getting the computer copy of the Anniversary Edition. I don't really care much about the Creation Club content, but when I could get a copy of Anniversary Edition for only $10, it was really a no-brainer. That's basically getting a regular copy of discounted Skyrim, plus a ton of paid DLC for free. However, the other reason I wanted AE was because I wanted to be absolutely sure that my mod list was running on the most up-to-date, most fully fleshed out version of the game, primarily so I could limit conflicts. There's a lot of derision focused at the Creation Club material, and while I certainly approve of the hatred towards microtransactions, I also think that mod authors should be compensated in some way for the hard work they're doing voluntarily. There are two wolves and all of that. Speaking of wolves, one of the first things I did after downloading graphical improvements was install a little mod called Moonlight Tales. I'm one of those people who plays the same character over and over and over again with a very little deviation. In my case, I always play a Khajiit werewolf named Varjak. He's always a stealth archer with a propensity towards one-handed axes and both destruction and restoration magics. He's not the most creative character, but I love him very much. What I don't love, however, are the base game restrictions about werewolves. It's really fun to just go full beast mode and hulk out over the local bandit population, but the restrictions make pulling out that form very dissatisfying. Not being able to loot or interact with objects means I have to backtrack to get all my goodies, and being restricted to only humans kind of shortens the list of useful prey, and only being able to shapeshift basically once a game session is really aggravating. Moonlight Tales doesn't just fix all these problems, it offers graphical updates, moon phases that may force you to shift on random nights, alliances with other wolves and werewolves, and even the possibility of being attacked by raiding parties. It also lets you finally turn into a werebear, something that should have been in the base game from the very start. Couple that with an updated talent tree, and I find myself pulling out this form just for the fun of it. It feels like a viable way to play the game now, and not just a neat little party trick to frighten the Whiterun townspeople for one night only. We didn't really touch on the talent trees of base Skyrim before, so let's go ahead and cover it now. To say the trees lack depth is not a new observation. I prefer it to the old point pie system of Oblivion, but I think they sanded off too many edges when they came up with the idea. They needed to add more, not less. And that is where Ordinator comes in. This talent system might have too much depth. Where before you could sink about a dozen talent points into do a thing, but more, and now many of those base game talents have been consolidated under the one perk point. Instead, the tree is filled with quality, combat-deepening perks. And one of my favorites is the light armor tree, which retroactively allows you to become a bare-handed brawler. The restoration tree isn't just the same healing and shield spells, but now adds poison and decay spells, not unlike playing a druid of the spore in D&D. If you ever wanted to be a bard and were disappointed with the Bard's College being kind of a joke, fear not, because now you can do that through the speech tree. Lockpicking lets you mind control automatons, and the list really does just go on. Unlike in base Skyrim, where I struggled to find where I wanted to put my next talent point because all the options were boring, and now I struggle because there's too many things I want right now. I simultaneously want to play multiple characters, while also keeping with mine and eventually unlocking everything the system has to offer. I could have pushed my mod list a little bit further, if I'm honest. I could have changed how the standing stones worked, reworked the vampires to be, fun, but this time around I really just wanted to focus on what I personally love to play. I think it worked out quite well. Of course, the part we're not saying out loud is that while it's admirable that Bethesda has embraced the modding community so thoroughly, it's also worth noting that the modding community needs to exist, because Bethesda kinda sorta, didn't finish their game. It's a double-edged sword, honestly. The sheer scope and scale of Skyrim made it a project that honestly could never have been finished if they hadn't stopped where they had. At the same time, in trying to aim for mass market appeal and get the game out as quickly as they could, it meant that they left a lot of the old depth and flavor on the cutting room floor. Mods fill the void, yes, but would they have needed to if Bethesda had just unmarried itself from its eye-catching 11/11/11 release date? And yet at the same time, this game wouldn't continue to be as successful as it is without the modding community. At the end of the day, the job of a game developer is to create a one-size-fits-all system. Players, however, don't want a one-size-fits-all, they want a one-size-fits-them, and that's not the same thing. Skyrim is an amazing 80% complete foundation, but that means if you want to enjoy it fully, you're going to have to go out and buy the other 20% and finish it yourself. If you want that, if you want that kind of tailored, bespoke experience, Skyrim is perfection. If you want a game that doesn't need mods to prop itself up, this situation is probably infuriating. I believe that modding is good, actually. Not a wild statement for the Skyrim community, but fairly uncommon in Planet Zoo circles, which my channel is usually part of. I think that modding, much like fanfiction, is a safe and beneficial playground for teaching budding developers the ins and outs of game systems and designs before they try their hand at a major studio or even producing their own game. It's not a perfect system. Naturally, in any large group of people centered around a single IP or concept, there will be controversy, but in this case I see modding as a net good for our society. Certainly for maintaining the replayability of this nearly 14-year-old game. Skyrim is strangely situated as a game that wasn't designed around replayability, does not need to be replayed, and yet we continually restart with new characters and new fantasies all the time. Ask any given Skyrim player how many times they've run Bleak Falls Barrow, and however many seconds they take to respond, multiply that by 5, and you have your answer. There's a lot of reasons why Skyrim somehow lands in this gray area. The first is obvious. If you want to play a different race, you probably need to restart the game. The face sculptor in Riften can only do so much to help you once a character is made. The second is nostalgia. If you want to go back and replay quests you've already beaten, then you'll have to restart the game as well, or at least backtrack to an older save. And the third is more about organization. Some people might like to have a character just for survival mode, another for regular, or for role-playing specific personalities and levels of evilness, or whatever. And of course, if you take a year off and forget where you're at, well, it might just be easier to restart the game than try and begin again from the middle of a soggy ruin. And that's before we get into mods, where adding a new major mod to your load order will almost certainly necessitate a fresh start. So considering there are a number of reasons to restart a game, it makes sense that this has become normal community behavior. But what I find interesting, however, is how the game itself thinks about replayability, and the way we can extrapolate that idea out to the rest of the gaming industry. Skyrim is built around save states. That means save scrubbing. If something doesn't work out, you can just go back in the timeline and reset to when things were still okay. It provides a safety net that real-time save states don't allow for, and I think this actually helps to add to that relaxing feeling of the game. However, it also comes with a consequence that you can basically always restart and go a different path, no matter how deep into a game you might be. In other words, you can create alternative branching timelines out of the same character without disrupting normal gameplay. Then there's the leveling system, which we briefly touched on to some extent, but not deep dived into. Skyrim does its best to drop away from the traditional level up motions by avoiding having one giant EXP pool, instead granting you levels based on how many skills you've leveled up. So if you level up Speechcraft 5 times, you gain a level just as certainly as you do if you leveled up One Hand, Light Armor, Heavy Armor, Stealth, and Alchemy just the once. Leveling up doesn't grant you an overall stat boost, but rather a boost to either your health, stamina, or magicka, whichever one you choose, and then whatever benefit you eventually decide to put your single perk point into. This gives leveling a more soft, organic feel, rather than leaning into the old RPG standard of, waking up the next morning and growing 3 inches in every direction. Once you get to the end of a perk tree, you can decide to legendary it, which gives you back your perk points and allows you to re-level that tree in order to boost your total level cap over 80. This gives you the benefits of regaining those perk points to spend in other trees that you actually care about now, but it comes with the downside that it will severely weaken your character if you do this in a tree that, you actually needed for combat. The benefits don't necessarily outweigh the cost, especially at high levels. In theory, this system offers you the maximum amount of customization in how you level your character. In practice, I think this system is almost designed to force the player to restart if they make too many mistakes. Take, for example, again, my character. I start as a stealth archer for ease of getting the game running and, beginning the leveling process. But by the time that I hit the level 15 or 20 mark, I've already begun to transition over to one-handed weapons and maybe even plate armor, which nullifies most of the trees that I've already built into. If I want those perk points back, I only have 2 options. I can push the skills I already have into Legendary, which requires time and patience, or I can restart and try for a fighter build right out of the gate. Either way, I've now wasted several hours on a build that is beneficial for early game, but is not actually the playstyle I wanted to use at this phase. And that's just looking at perk points. If we want to look at stat allocation, a fighter to archer is actually one of the easiest transitions to make. Both builds rely heavily on health and stamina. The problem comes if you want to go from either of those builds into mage, where magicka is king. If you haven't been allocating stat buffs into that pool, you're basically starting from ground zero, and either you need to exploit the auxiliary systems, level even farther, or just start from scratch. None of these answers is ideal when you're several dozen hours into a new game. This means that by its own mechanics, Skyrim has extreme replayability. That's even before we get into how the game handles things like quests, where certain choices can lock you out of other events. For example, if you decide to pursue this string of murders in Markarth, you'll eventually land in jail and have the option to side with either the Silverbloods or the Reachmen. You can do one or the other, but never both. This is also true of the Civil War, and several of the Daedric quests, and even the Dawnguard DLC. In other words, if you want to see everything the game has to offer, you will need to play it at least twice. So, now that we understand how the game encourages players to restart, despite being built around systems that want you to stick with one character, I think we need to look at whether this is a strength or a weakness. Oh, once again, I think it's a bit of both. Some of the push towards replayability is due to an inability to coerce the systems to change once you've started the game. And this permanency of things like stats and quest decisions is important for giving you the feeling that your choices matter. On the other hand, there were ways where they could have, made your character a little more malleable to prevent a lot of the needless fresh restarts. Is it really so much to ask to pay the face sculptor in Riften a hefty chunk of change to reset your stat bonuses? On the other hand, I can't help but see this willingness of the game to lock you out of certain content as anything but a benefit. I don't want to be able to see everything a game has to offer on my first playthrough, because, well, if I can, then there's no reason to revisit it outside of maybe a few YouTube videos. But let's take a step back and look at where Skyrim fits in the timeline. Once again, it's a great transition point between one phase of the industry and another. Skyrim often gets criticized for not giving you enough of these decisionary points. To that I say, yeah, kind of. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want every single quest to have 10 different endings with 10 different effects on the world. Sometimes I just want to play a straightforward, simple quest that gives me exactly what's advertised on the tin. On the other hand, there are several places in the storyline where I wish I could have had more options. Like, for example, I wish siding with either the Blades or the Greybeards was a little more meaningful. More like their actual factions. As it stands, it feels more like I'm being shunted between my two angry divorced parents. If we look at this odd mix of linearity and multiple outcome quests as a data point on a timeline, though, we can start to chart the evolution of replayability across the genre. In Morrowind and Oblivion, it was fairly normal for your characters and playstyle to completely lock you out of certain guilds, or even for siding with one guild to lock you out and destroy another. For example, if you wanted to join the Fighters Guild in Oblivion, you will eventually be required to destroy the Thieves Guild in order to progress the story. So essentially, you hit this point of no return very early on, based on things like your build and who you happen to meet first, that potentially denies you content you maybe wanted to see, but it does also give you multiple endings, multiple meaningful endings. This is good for replayability overall, but the moment of decision feels pretty bad. It sucks to know that you're resigning yourself to another 10 hours of playing through the exact same scripted content just to see the other side of a quest line. Just because you built your character wrong. There is the option to save scrub or complete the game in an extremely specific order, but it's not ideal. However, games after Skyrim, both Bethesda lines and the greater industry, I would argue seem to have developed an almost allergic reaction to giving the player too much choice. Jumping over to World of Warcraft for a moment, when the game first launched, if you wanted to see everything Azeroth had to offer, you would need to make and level at least 2 characters, 1 Alliance and 1 Horde, and then possibly more if you wanted the full experience of the starting zones. You simply could not see everything the game had to offer on one character. However, in more modern times, your choice doesn't matter. I'm sorry, it doesn't. The Alliance and Horde sides of quests are virtually identical, with only the colors on the flags being swapped from red to blue or vice versa. And that's if you even get to go to a different quest hub at all. For the most part, everybody plays the exact same storyline the exact same way over and over and over again, and the game relies on having multiple leveling avenues like questing and dungeons to keep the player occupied on all accounts. Baldur's Gate stands in stark contrast to this, as do many CRPGs like Rogue Trader, where the goal seemed to be to account for every possible decision a player can make and give hundreds of different outcomes to 1,000 little choices. While this does give the full immersive deep dive I think a lot of RPG players are looking for when it comes to replayability and player choice, it is an extraordinary amount of work on the developers. In essence, it creates a game in which the collective of humanity will eventually explore every nook and cranny their game has to offer, but no single player will likely ever see all potential outcomes. I think this forms something more like a bell curve, of which Skyrim sits firmly in the middle. On the one side, you have developers who know and aren't afraid to admit that they might spend hours of their life developing one system or tree or cutscene that nobody will ever experience. On the other side, you have a developer who is almost begging every single one of their players to look at their report card and see how much work and love and passion they put into their magnum opus. I think saying that one method is objectively better than another is simply denying several realities of game development and who players are. Any somewhat mainstream game you have played has taken thousands, if not tens of thousands of collective man-hours to laboriously create, and it is totally reasonable for the humans behind these games to have different perspectives on how much of their art they're excited for you to see. It's also not taking into account the different kinds of players that will congregate around certain titles. Not all players want to have 1,000 choices culminate into a bespoke, tailored ending. Sometimes they just want to play a good, focused story with a strong, well-reasoned conclusion. Meanwhile, other people don't care if a game ever ends at all. They just want the option to play their way. And yet others want to see every possible outcome of a timeline. There is no way to please one group while also accommodating every other. You have to choose which group to cater to and stick with your decision till the bitter end. And this is where I think Skyrim ends up getting the most criticism levied at its story. The people who want a well-reasoned conclusion are going to be stuck knowing that ultimately, their game will continue within the status quo. People who want multiple endings will inevitably feel trapped doing the same thing over and over again with barely any more than cosmetic differences to show the change in the world. And people who want the game to continue forever will eventually be relegated to the Radiant Quest system, effectively locking them out of the factions that they have invested so much time into. Skyrim's one-size-fits-all approach fits none, and so naturally it's going to get criticized to hell and back for not being willing to put its foot down. Skyrim is enigmatic, a complex blend of the past and future all melded together into a single point around which an entire industry seems to inadvertently revolve. On one side of the timeline, we have the nostalgia and old systems of the past, rooted in tabletop, and on the other, we have a world fueled by metrics, formula, and computational power. Skyrim did not mean to be the focal point around which these ideas revolved, but it is. And I think that, more than its bugs or gameplay systems, or even its world, is its true legacy. It's the game that made Bethesda a household name, and it's the standard to which all games are now held and compared. Some meet the challenge, others not so much. It even extends outside of its own sphere to impact other companies like Obsidian and BioWare. When Avowed first entered the market, it was compared not to its contemporaries like Outer Worlds, but to Skyrim, as though Obsidian needed to live up to and exceed the reputation of its sister once again, as New Vegas had done with the rest of the Fallout franchise so long ago. This impact crater, no matter how inadvertent or intended it was, has, I think, left Skyrim in a place of beloved contention. Not quite meeting the expectations of past Elder Scrolls installations, but far outperforming Bethesda's future projects. And this dichotomy has left us with a lot to say. 13 years worth of things to say, in fact, and even now, I don't think we're quite done talking about and revisiting this harsh winter wonderland. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for joining me. I could really only cover the systems and history of the game in this video, but I'm excited to start working on a retrospective regarding the game's story and world building, so with any hope that should be out on the channel soon. If you're interested in seeing that, well, you know what to do, and in the meantime, may your roads lead you to wonderful new adventures.